The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education. Connect to a world of learning.
Grab your musket and prepare for battle because Assignment Discovery is saving the Union in the Civil War, a nation divided.
First, we'll examine the economies of the North and the South to see their insurmountable differences in discord, clash, and conflict.
Then we'll learn how slavery became the issue that caused secession and led to civil war in North versus South.
Next, we'll watch as the Union and Confederate States suffered in A Nation Goes to War.
Finally, scientists and historians investigate the multiple attempts on President Lincoln's life in The Plots Against the President.
Yankees and Confederates, coming up next.
As you watch the first half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
What inventions affected the economies of the North and the South?
How did the South depend on labor from enslaved Africans?
America's economy was booming in the early 1800s. Inventions and new technologies helped production rates skyrocket. But slavery drove the South's economy, and many in the North disagreed with this suppressive institution.
What inventions or new products do you depend on?
I depend on cars because I need to go certain places that are too far away to walk to.
My cell phone. I can't live without my cell phone.
Microwave, I use a lot.
I definitely depend on my iPod.
I'm definitely extremely dependent upon my cell phone and my computer.
The internet, if that's kind of an invention, I'm really dependent on the internet. Just, keep aware of the news and, contact other people.
That's not only an entertainment necessity, but it's also something that you can get information from.
Computer, because most of our homework is transmitted through our email.
Plasma TV. We just got one, and I couldn't live without it.
In the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution was dramatically changing life in Britain. Inventions such as the steam engine and new industrial machinery were transforming factories, textile mills, and even farms. By the 1800s, these changes had made their way to America, and new inventions dramatically changed people's lives. Inventions such as the telegraph revolutionized the way Americans communicated with one another, and transportation became faster and easier. In 1817, New Yorkers found a way to transport the growing farming resources of America to their doorstep. They built a canal linking the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The sheer scale of the project was immense. The canal stretched more than 360 miles and had 83 locks and 18 aqueducts. And it was all built using the muscle power of men, horses, mules, and oxen. After 8 years of construction, the Erie Canal opened in 1825. The cost of transporting a ton of grain from central New York State to New York City plunged from $100 to just $6. The Port of New York became the focal point for trade between many American states and the rest of the world. Soon, the invention of the steamboat allowed for faster transportation along other waterways and opened the Midwest to trade and settlement. And the invention of the railroad allowed for faster land travel. By 1840, about 3,000 miles of track had been laid in the United States. Since railroads often followed canal routes, New York benefited from them too. In the 1800s, New York City became the chief destination for hundreds of thousands of immigrants. These immigrants, mostly from Germany and Ireland, contributed to a dramatic population increase in the United States. Many of the Irish immigrants were escaping the Irish potato famine. The potato was the staple food of Ireland, but in 1845, a disease destroyed entire crops. With nothing to eat, the Irish faced widespread starvation. A mass exodus began. In just 5 years, 1 million men, women, and children left Ireland for America. Most of the Irish immigrants who arrived in the United States between 1845 and 1851 were poor farmers. But without any money to buy land, most stayed in the city and found work in construction. Irish workers also helped to build many of America's railroads. The booming cities and towns of 1800s America sparked a rush away from farms and villages. Soon, many more people were living in the industrialized North than in the agricultural South. The North, the home of the free states, and the South, the home of the slave states, developed distinct cultures and economies. While northern cities were prospering, the South's plantations were booming too. British textile mills were flourishing, and the demand for Southern cotton was soaring. A 1790s invention, the cotton gin, allowed plantation workers to clean 50 times more cotton fiber by machine than by hand. Southern landowners planted more fields with cotton. As cotton production spread, so did slavery. Landowners bought more land and more slaves as they tried to earn more money. The South's economy became entirely dependent on slave labor. In 1818, there were 11 free and 11 slave states. That year, Missouri, which had slavery, applied to join the Union. Tensions between the states flared as Northerners worried that allowing a new slave state would give the slave states more power than the free states. So in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Maine, a free state, was allowed into the Union along with Missouri. The balance of power was maintained, but the issue of slavery would continue to haunt the nation for decades to come.
Did you know the cotton gin helped farmers make a profit from their crops? But Eli Whitney, the inventor of the machine, did not see much profit himself. Patent problems and legal battles kept his pockets and bank account empty.
Abolitionists in the North wanted to end slavery, but Southern business owners knew their economic survival relied on slave labor. In bitter disagreement, the two sides continued to move farther and farther apart. Have you ever had to fight for something you believed in?
My parents said I should stop dancing because it came in conflict with my academics, and I had to convince them over time that I did love dance so much, and now I'm still dancing.
There was a list that went around the school, and people were writing things on the list that they disliked about my friend, and I stuck by my friend.
I'm fighting against the dress code saying that you have to have your shirt tucked in.
I had an argument with my mom a few weeks ago. I wanted my curfew to be moved from midnight to 1, and I told her that she should trust me enough to know that I won't do anything that I'm not supposed to, and trust me enough to know that I pick good friends, and she finally moved it to 1:30.
I really wanted to make the varsity tennis team this year, so I went to all these camps over the summer, and I played 4 hours every day during the week, and I still didn't make it.
The years leading up to the Civil War were filled with tension between the North and South. Differences in their economies, technology, politics, and society strained their relationship and the unity of the country. But the most pressing issue may have been slavery, especially whether to allow new slaveholding states to enter the Union. Without slave labor, the South could not continue to grow massive amounts of cotton. Southerners feared that the end of slavery would bring about an economic collapse. They felt that only by having an equal number of free and slave states could they protect slavery. The issue came to a head in 1850 when California applied for admission as a state, a free state. The South threatened to secede or withdraw from the nation if the new state was admitted. Congress finally settled the issue with a compromise. California was admitted as a free state, but other areas in the West would be open to slavery if the people wanted. And Congress passed a tough new law that required the return of runaway slaves. Northerners protested this new law, the Fugitive Slave Act. Abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe was outraged by this law. She wrote a powerful novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, to show how unjust slavery was. The novel illustrated one slave's humanity and suffering at the hands of his cruel master. The novel stunned Northerners who had been indifferent to slavery. Southerners were outraged, calling the book unfair propaganda. The debate over slavery in the territories focused next on Kansas and Nebraska. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a new law in Congress. It allowed the majority of settlers in each territory to decide whether or not they would allow slavery in the area. This was called popular sovereignty. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery people began streaming into Kansas. They set up rival governments and began fighting each other. Kansas gained the nickname Bleeding Kansas from the bloody Civil War. While the fighting went on in Kansas, the Supreme Court issued a controversial decision in a case involving a slave named Dred Scott. The court said that Congress had no power to ban slavery anywhere, not even in the territories. Abolitionist John Brown had a bold plan to strike against slavery. In 1859, he led a band of followers to seize guns in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown's plan was to lead slaves into a revolt. But the plan failed. Brown was captured, convicted of treason, and hanged. The debate over slavery had led to the forming of a new political party, the Republican Party. It vowed to block the spread of slavery to the territories. In 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southerners worried that Lincoln would move to end slavery in the South. Soon after Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and 6 other states followed. They took over government-controlled post offices and forts. Jefferson Davis was elected as the president of the new nation these states formed, the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln refused to give up a fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, Confederate gunners in Charleston opened fire on the fort. After being shelled for 34 hours, the troops inside the fort surrendered. With the shelling of Fort Sumter, the Civil War had begun.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
What inventions affected the economies of the North and the South?
How did the South depend on labor from enslaved Africans?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the second half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
How was the Civil War unlike any other previous war?
Why did the Confederate States want to remove Lincoln from office?
After political battles failed, Southern states seceded and formed their own government. But President Lincoln was willing to fight to maintain the Union. The industrial economy of the North would prevail and bring the states back together. What do people at your school compete over?
Competing for grades, it's like there's a lot of stress to perform well and like perform to the same standard or above the standard of your classmates.
People compete in my school for grades and for getting, being faster on the track team, throwing farther, stuff like that.
Competition is kind of like, makes me feel good about myself if I do good, or if I do bad, it makes you try harder.
The fun of having the challenge of having something to strive for.
When we play against a rival, it's like no other game. I mean, you go out and you leave everything out on the field.
I just love the heat of being under pressure. I love having to win.
Definitely the goal, just knowing that you could succeed and do well, and just to prove it to yourself that you could do things.
Long-growing tensions between the North and South over the issue of slavery erupted into the Civil War in 1861. In late 1860 and early 1861, 7 southern states seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, after federal forces refused to turn it over to South Carolina's troops. War had begun. The day after Fort Sumter's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln called for the remaining states in the Union to send troops to put down the rebellion in the southern states. Soon, men on both sides eagerly signed up to fight. Early on, people believed that the war would end quickly. Spectators even packed picnic meals to watch the first major fight of the war, the Battle of Bull Run. But the Civil War was unlike any previous conflict. It was the world's first industrial war. Mass-produced weapons and trench warfare resulted in huge losses on both sides. The destruction of homes and farms brought the war home to civilians. The struggle proved anything but quick. At first, the South more than held its own against the North. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had great success against the Union early in the war. Many Southerners felt that if the South could hold on long enough, people in the North would eventually lose the will to fight and let the Confederate States go. But on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln made a dramatic change in the war. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation made slavery illegal in the 11 rebelling southern states, seen here in light gray. Although it left slavery in place in the dark blue border states, which had stayed loyal to the Union, Lincoln's proclamation shifted the emphasis of the war. Now it was more than a fight to keep the nation together. It was also a struggle to free the slaves. Eventually, the North's larger population and greater industrial power overcame the South. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Other Southern armies also surrendered, and the war was over. The North's victory came at a huge cost, though. The Civil War had raged for 4 long and bloody years. Much of the South lay in ruins. Countless families lost their homes, and more than 600,000 soldiers had died. More than the American losses in World War I and II, Korea, and Vietnam put together. But after the smoke cleared and the dead were buried, the Union was preserved. The authority of the federal government was solidified, and slavery was ended. Did you know Union General Ulysses S. Grant took the city of Vicksburg, Louisiana from Confederate General John C. Pemberton on July 4, 1863. Upset by defeat, the city wouldn't celebrate another 4th of July for 81 years.
Lincoln's push to end slavery angered the Confederates. They felt it was an attempt to bring the Southern economy to a halt and bolster the booming Northern economy. Confederate leaders knew that removing Lincoln from power would leave the Union weak and could lead to Southern victory. But how many attempts would it take?
How can a strong leader in your student government help the student body?
Affect and help the student body by making certain changes that benefit us. Like, for example, what our student body president did recently in the student government was we got a vending machine, and that helps us out because the snack stand that we have closes at 3:30.
Our student body president is really energetic, and she's really enthusiastic and creative and intelligent, so it inspires us to do better academically.
I myself am on student government, and through organizing things like homecoming and spring fling and proposals about dress code and whatnot, we can make the school a more comfortable place.
I think the student body president could help connect to the different sections of the school, extracurricular-wise, like arts could be more interested in sports, and people who do sports could be more interested in the arts.
A fanatical assassin determined to avenge the South. An American icon cut down at his moment of triumph. Everyone knows the story of John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln. But what many people don't know is that this was only one of a series of plots to kill the president.
I think Lincoln was a marked man from day one. I think he was a marked man the minute he stepped into office.
Lincoln was a moving target who survived several very near misses.
It may very well be that Lincoln provoked his own assassination.
Did Lincoln try to assassinate Jefferson Davis only to become a victim himself?
In sanctioning this raid, he signs his own death warrant.
How close did a plan to blow up the White House come to changing history?
It would have blown up the state dining room above.
Now, the secret history of the Civil War and the plot against Lincoln. At a testing range in rural Virginia, a team of explosives experts will recreate one of the most audacious assassination plots in American history. A scheme to blow up the White House. Target, Abraham Lincoln. Time of attack, July 2nd, 1864, just 2 weeks before the president would be killed at Ford's Theater.
This box at Ford's Theater stands as a shrine to the fallen Abraham Lincoln. His murder, however, was not an isolated act of violence, but in fact the last in a series of attempts on his life that began 4 years earlier.
Today, Abraham Lincoln is justly revered as perhaps our greatest president. But 140 years ago, Lincoln was one of the most hated men in America. Lincoln had been the target of at least one assassination attempt before the war had even started. Following his election in November 1860, conspirators hatched a plot to kill Lincoln on the way to his own inauguration.
The inaugural train was scheduled to stop in Baltimore. There, pro-secessionists would assassinate him.
Among the conspirators were many prominent Baltimore citizens, including Police Superintendent George Kane. Word of the plot reached Lincoln's security detail. They rerouted Lincoln's train to Washington, D.C. The new president did not let this attempt move him from his course. Convinced that the Union had to be preserved at all costs, he took a hard line with the rebellious Southern states.
The length that Lincoln would go to preserve the Union was great. I mean, here was a man who had the courage to do whatever needed to be done.
In the spring of 1861, secessionist troops fired on Fort Sumter. Our nation's bloodiest war had begun. By 1864, at least 500,000 Americans had died. The appalling slaughter did little for Lincoln's appeal on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. In addition, the Confederates had been outraged by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had freed the slaves in the southern states.
What that proclamation does is it validates the fears of the South. It validates fears that they had in the very beginning about this president. It generates a process by which now the South is going to have to take President Lincoln out of office.
During Lincoln's presidency, there were 6 or more plots to either kill or kidnap him. At least 3 plots progressed beyond the planning stages. According to documents in the National Archives, Abraham Lincoln may have brought those assassination attempts on himself.
The perception by the Confederacy was Lincoln had authorized the capture or assassination of their president, Jefferson Davis.
The plots against Lincoln ran the gamut from the plausible to the ridiculous. In 1861, it was rumored that Southern sympathizers had sent the president-elect a jar of poison preserves. 2 years later, the presidential carriage was allegedly sabotaged. The driver's seat had been tampered with, throwing the driver from the coach and leaving the president's wife helpless in the back. She was seriously injured as she jumped for her life. In 1864, Confederate agents attempted to infect Lincoln with clothing contaminated with yellow fever, but the garments never made it to Washington. In addition, Confederate sympathizers hatched sporadic plots to kidnap Lincoln and use him as a hostage. But Confederate President Davis viewed these plots as violations of the rules of war.
Fire in the hole!
A team of experts has assembled to examine the most credible assassination plots against Lincoln. Michael Yardley, marksman. Mike Koshin, historical explosives expert. Ken Malley, explosives analyst. Eve Hinman, structural engineer. Our investigation begins with the only time in American history a president came under enemy fire while in office. Hinman will determine the bomb's impact on the Lincoln White House. On July 2, 1864, as the Confederate Army threatened Washington, D.C., Lincoln went to the battlefield to survey the situation. An officer standing beside him was hit in the thigh. Lincoln was quickly escorted to safety. Most historians believe this was simply a random shot, but a closer investigation reveals that history may be wrong.
We think that there could have been individual sharpshooters at 400, 500 yards, just as we are pretty sure that they mostly were at 1,000 yards.
Confederate sharpshooters positioned near the fort may have been targeting the president. The question is, could Confederate riflemen have known it was Lincoln, and could they have hit their mark? Marksman Michael Yardley examines a Civil War rifle to see if it could be done.
You hit probably 6 foot left to the top of the berm.
I'm feeling not quietly confident, but I'm highly motivated.
Could this shot have been a deliberate attempt to kill President Lincoln and change the course of the war? The Civil War was the bloodiest in American history. Waves of men assaulting defenses of cannon and rifle devastated armies on both sides of the conflict. But amongst the lines of common troops were an elite corps of sharpshooters. On a July afternoon in 1864, they almost changed the course of American history. For 2 days, rebel troops were threatening to break through the Union lines and storm Washington, D.C. The Union's final line of defense was Fort Stevens. With the future of the Union in the balance, Lincoln felt he had to visit the fort for himself. He knew the risks, but made the journey anyway.
Lincoln and all kind of people came out to see this battle that was going to happen out here because the Confederates were definitely threatening the capture of Washington. And by the 11th and 12th of July, you've got 16,000 Confederates actually inside the District of Columbia.
At 3 p.m., the Confederates opened fire, nearly killing the president. But was Lincoln the target? Could Confederate riflemen have known who they were firing at? To answer that question, we must first determine the Confederates' location and what they could see. modern buildings have blocked any hope of reconstructing the Confederates' view of the fort. In fact, everywhere we went, our view of Fort Stevens was obscured.
We can actually go see right in that whole general area to the parking lot is where these sharpshooters would have been.
On a firing range with 1,000 yards of unobstructed view, experts used a laser range finder to determine the distance from the sharpshooter's position to where Lincoln would have been standing, at least 800 yards away. The camera was set up to approximate a sharpshooter's view. Clearly, a subject standing over 800 yards away could not be seen with the naked eye. But the rebel sharpshooter would usually work with a spotter who would use field glasses or binoculars to sight a target. The camera's lens simulated the power of the binoculars, and the subject comes into view. It's clear that the Confederate sharpshooters could have made out President Lincoln's characteristic profile. But could they have deliberately hit him with a rifle shot from that long a distance? Marksman Michael Yardley hopes to find out. In an experiment, Yardley will use one of the most accurate rifles of the era, the Whitworth. With its specially designed rifling and hexagonal bullet, it had a range of more than 1,000 yards. But will Yardley be able to make an 800-yard shot? Yardley must calibrate the gun's sights, and his test begins at 100 yards.
That wasn't a bad shot. Where did it go?
It doesn't get any better than that. Take a look for yourself.
Thank you, sir.
An amazing shot.
With a 100-yard shot a success, he moves back to 400 yards, where the difficulty increases exponentially.
It is getting on for, an extreme range with a muzzleloader. And moreover, we've got the problem of the wind. So, as you can see, the wind's coming from that direction. Effectively, that makes the shot a little bit longer. In other words, because the wind is blowing into the bullet as the bullet's going down range, we have to increase the elevation. How much is the elevation going to be at this range? Well, I would guess something in the region of 20-25 feet. We're going to have to aim 20-25 feet above the target to bring the bullet in onto it.
You hit the metal?
Just right over.
Did it go through the board?
Went to the right of the witness board.
To the right side.
I'm encouraged.
Direct hit on the right target.
And that was with a considerable aim off to the left, and we're still only hitting the right-hand target, but no, great, we made it happen.
After a full day of practice at shorter distances, Yardley moves back to the goal of 800 yards, the distance between the Confederate sharpshooters and Lincoln.
The weapon, of course, has got a very simple, fairly crude sighting system. We've got to crank these old sights up, bring them up to the 800-yard mark, and experiment. Misfire. Misfire.
Almost all Civil War muskets and rifles used black powder, and they were prone to misfires and jamming. And after a long day, the cold weather begins to affect the gun, frustrating Yardley and disrupting the experiment.
How far left?
You hit probably 6 foot left to the top of the berm.
So we were low. Having made the shot at 400 yards, I think we could make a shot at 800 yards, but we're running out of light.
See that shot?
It was like making a whirling buzzing
Okay,
sound.
here we go.
You look like you're about 6 feet right, boss.
At the end of the day, Yardley is closing in on his goal. But with the misfires and fading light, he is unable to hit the target.
I don't think Lady Luck has been a friend today. Way off. Sorry.
But Yardley is convinced the shot can be done. 6 days later, he tries again at another firing range. After sighting the target, he takes his first shot at 800 yards.
Do you know, I think I just might have hit that.
Yardley hits the target on the first shot.
Well, it's not much of a shot. Not much of a shot, but it's a hit, and it was a first shot hit. So I have to say I'm pleasantly surprised. I knew it was possible. Whether or not I could do it today, with all the wind and all the problems we've had with the guns, another matter. But I always thought that this was possible, and indeed, I think you'd even make a hit in ideal conditions and with a bit of luck at 1,000 yards.
The test shows Lincoln's close call at Fort Stevens may have been more than a random lucky shot. Less than a month later, however, Lincoln again barely escaped being shot, this time at a much closer range. It is hard to imagine a time when a president could be so unprotected, and harder to imagine such lax security in a time of war. Lincoln was riding all alone from the White House to the old soldier's home 5 miles away. From nearby woods, a shot rang out, knocking Lincoln's hat from his head. Private John Nichols, who was standing guard at the home, later found that hat with a hole in it. Lincoln said it was a foolish hunter probably accidentally discharging his weapon. But more than likely, the president had survived another attempt on his life. Clearly, the anger directed toward Lincoln was political and personal. Confederate soldiers and radicals wanted him dead.
When his views became known about slavery, then he was definitely the man to kill. And I think that Lincoln knew it was possible that he would be killed.
It wasn't long before the Confederates devised one of their most daring plots, the bombing of the White House. Lincoln's assassination at the hands of John Wilkes Booth marked the end of Lincoln's presidency and a series of attempts on his life. From the moment he was elected to office in 1860, Lincoln was the target of murderous conspirators, Confederate sharpshooters, and the rebel leader Jefferson Davis.
The Confederate government has a fear, and that fear is that Abraham Lincoln is going to take from them everything that they've ever built up, everything that they've ever had. So the plots to kill him show just how desperate the South was.
But the most daring assassination plan of all was the bombing of the White House. In modern times, terrorists have taken thousands of lives with homemade bombs. Compact, easy to disguise, small amounts of explosives unleash huge devastation. During the Civil War, the preferred explosive was black powder, a form of gunpowder used in rifles, cannons, and bombs. And it was readily available to anyone. On April 2, 1865, the Confederate defeat would be less than a week away. Sergeant Thomas Hardy and other members of the Confederate Secret Service left Richmond on one last desperate covert mission. They carried with them the makings of a bomb intended to blow up the White House. It was only a chance encounter with a Union cavalry patrol that foiled their plot. But would it have worked? At Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia, a team created its own black powder bomb to examine the Confederates' plot. This is what's left of a Civil War time bomb after 25 pounds of black powder have torn it apart. But would it have been enough to destroy a portion of the White House and kill President Lincoln? explosives expert Mike Koshin will build 2 bombs that would likely have been used in the plot.
For this application, I think we just decided to go with something where 1 or 2 people can pull this off and do it, with a very quick timetable.
2 types of bombs known to have been used during the Civil War may have fit the bill. One was a simple wooden box.
This is a mock-up that I made. This represents a container with black powder in it. And this is the firing mechanism where the hammer would actually engage on a musket cap and set it off.
The other looked like a lard container, but was actually an underwater time bomb called a dripped torpedo.
Of an underwater, this one is a reconstruction that I made, and again it has the identical or similar clock mechanism inside.
The timing mechanism in each was actually the inner workings of an alarm clock. The bell replaced with a firing cap.
As the clock wound down in about 30 minutes or 40 minutes, it would set the hammer against the musket cap there, and then this would explode.
For the purposes of experiment, Koshin fabricated the containers of the 2 bombs, each able to hold 25 pounds of black powder. He'll fill them and set them off. But how to determine their destructive power and the effect they may have had on the White House? With this.
This is the sensing element right here?
That's exactly right.
And what exactly is it going to do?
It's going to measure the dynamic pressure wave as it passes across the element.
The sensor will record those pressures during the tests and give the engineers the data they need to determine the bomb's effect on the White House.
Couple more. That's 75.
Fire in the hole! 3, 2, 1.
The data from the sensor reveals the force of the blast to be just 1.5 pounds per square inch.
Is that what you anticipated?
Actually, no. I thought it'd be much more than that. But that charge there wasn't anything to that charge at all.
In slow motion, it's easy to see how quickly the box blew apart, which allowed the force of the explosion to dissipate into the air. The second bomb, the metal container, should give a much more powerful explosion.
This first explosion, that was a wooden box. The next one, we're going to actually use a metal container. Do you think there might be something different in the register that time?
If it's a the heavier the wall metal container, the better, because the charge will have more time to burn inside and build pressure before it bursts and comes out.
Right.
So yeah, you'd get a lot more pressure out of that.
The metal container was again filled with 25 pounds of black powder and detonated.
Fire in the hole! 3, 2, 1.
The results from the second blast were more dramatic, almost 3 pounds per square inch.
Well, that's almost double from the previous blast.
They put it in a metal can,
right?
Sealed it up, let it build pressure before the can ruptured, which gave you more of a blast than we had before.
The pressure data indicates something else. The metal bomb would have been a much better choice for an assassination. But if the Confederate assassins used a bomb similar to this, the question remains, could it have killed a president? The answer depends in part on where they could place the bomb. The enormous security around the White House today makes planting a bomb impossible. But in 1865, the White House was a much different place.
The president lived pretty freely. There were guards at the gates and a guard in the second floor hall and the first floor hall at night, and then the usual daytime guards that let people in and out.
But the west basement doors, hidden by the greenhouse, were particularly vulnerable.
The White House greenhouse was on top of what they called the West Terrace. It was on a level with the state floor. Between that wing and the house was a breezeway, and then the doors, the west doors to the basement.
Hidden by the greenhouse, an assassin could carry a bomb undetected into the White House. But once inside, where could he place it for the deadliest effect?
I'm no 1865 bombardier, but if I were to do it, I would have slipped in the west end door of the basement and slipped into a storage room immediately to the right and put the infernal machine, as they probably called it, there, and then it would have blown up the state dining room above.
If this were the planned location of the bomb, what effect would it have had? Could one of the black powder bombs have collapsed the floor of the dining room and killed all those in the room above?
The bomb so far has not been that impressive, but then again, we've had it in open spaces, so the pressure has been exerted quickly on the wood box, a little bit slower on the metal, but now we're putting it inside this confined structure.
In one final test, a bomb was placed inside a structure of the same dimensions, but not the same materials, as the White House storeroom.
Here's the problem we face. First of all, this is a wooden structure, and it's a light wooden structure. It doesn't even have the types of beams that you would see in the White House. And on top of that, the White House was built of brick. But we could take the data from our probes and approximate what that pressure is and how much damage it would have caused to the White House.
The bomb was located hidden along one of the walls where the assassins most likely would have placed it. And the sensor was just 5 feet away. How much would the structure increase the power of the bomb? Would it be enough to destroy the building?
Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! 3, 2, 1.
That room really contained the force, and you know, she blew the whole thing apart. It was great experiment.
It was like a balloon. As the gases expanded out, it reached the point where it could no longer contain it, and the balloon exploded.
But how much did the structure increase the power of the explosion?
It's the same explosive weight, right? It was inside the building, which helped contain the pressure, which drove the pressure up, right? As compared to being out in the open, right? The first one.
The pressure of the blast doubled in strength from the previous test because the structure allowed the pressure to build. But would it have been enough to kill a president? Of all the alleged plots to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln, the most daring was the bombing of the White House. The investigation of that plot determined the effect an 1865 explosive had on a modern-day plywood structure. But how much damage would it have produced on the White House, and would it have succeeded in assassinating the president? Structural engineer Eve Hinman will determine the bomb's impact on the Lincoln White House.
Well, the key things to look at are the size of the explosive, where it is placed, and what the confinement is. For instance, is it confined in a small space or not? And thirdly, what is the structure made out of? Are we talking about concrete, brick, wood?
Hinman looked at the structural elements of Lincoln's White House, as well as the video of the explosion that destroyed the wooden structure.
You can see that the roof is going directly upward and the walls are falling out to the side. Of course, in the White House, we would have had confinement provided by thick walls, which would have provided some containment for the explosive and would have caused the explosive force to be mostly directed in the upward direction.
But what would a bomb like this do to the much more substantial White House?
The direction of the force would have been directly upward onto the floor of the state dining room, where Lincoln could be with the many VIPs, and that would have been the kill zone. Here we would expect a lot of fatalities, a lot of deaths immediately above the weapon. So I think it's clear that even though this was a relatively small weapon, it was a very lethal weapon that most probably would have killed Lincoln and the other people in the state dining room.
This experiment suggests that the Confederacy might have succeeded in their plot to eliminate Lincoln had the conspirators not been captured. It was on April 14, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth prevailed where the others had failed. But did Booth and his conspirators, most of whom were hung for their complicity in the plot, act independently? Or were they working for the Confederate Secret Service?
I believe that John Wilkes Booth was a willing vessel for the Confederate government to use because of his animosity, his anger, his frustration as to the conduct of the war, his hatred of Abraham Lincoln. I think he was a ripe candidate.
But Booth's actions in the days leading up to and after the assassination suggest he may have been more.
We do know that the Confederate government did support and help Booth. The places that were available to him to hide and plan, the people that he knew, these were all people associated with the Confederate government.
In September 1864, a Confederate spy recruited Booth to kidnap Lincoln from his coach. Only a change in Lincoln's schedule frustrated their plot. Between October 1864 and April 1865, Booth met at least 5 times with Confederate agents as far north as Montreal. Each stop on his escape route was a rebel safe house. It was 2 weeks before Booth was finally shot by a Union soldier in a barn in Virginia. We may never know if Booth was working for the Confederates. But the evidence suggests that his act at Ford's Theater extended past his small circle of co-conspirators. By that time, the Civil War had ended and the Confederacy had surrendered. Lincoln's defense of the Union had prevailed. But what would have happened if Lincoln had died before the end of the war? How would the destiny of America have changed?
His death clearly would have led to the dissolution of the Union war effort. Virtually every family in the country has been affected at this point. They have lost husbands, fathers, sons. The consensus that Lincoln had been able to build after Fort Sumter is losing its momentum.
Without Lincoln's passionate defense of the Union, Northern leaders may have tired of the bloodshed.
I think had Lincoln been assassinated in 1864, right around election time or prior to the election, I believe anybody else stepping up into the White House would have right away, immediately started negotiations for a settlement of peace with Southerners, establishing the Confederate States of America, thereby also ensuring that slavery would in fact go on.
The Confederate secession would have had implications far beyond American slavery.
That would have established a precedent for secession, for the establishment of a separate nation, and that would probably have meant the eventual balkanization of the United States.
What we know today as the United States might have looked like Europe, a continent of separate independent nations.
That would have prevented the development of the very powerful economic and ultimately military power that the United States became.
The conclusion may be speculative, but the reality is that Lincoln's survival to the end of the war determined modern America. And an earlier Confederate success in killing Abraham Lincoln would have created a very different world.
Lincoln brought us all together. We are one nation today because he had the courage to do that.
His fierce defense of the Union remains his legacy.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
How was the Civil War unlike any other previous war?
Why did the Confederate States want to remove Lincoln from office?
We hope you've enjoyed this assignment discovery journey into the Civil War, a nation divided. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
That's a wrap for today, but tune in next time as we head west at high noon. We'll watch the migration of settlers from the East Coast over the Mississippi. We'll witness the construction of towns built around railroad stops, and we'll learn the truth about life as a cowboy. Join us next time for At the Western Frontier, here on Assignment Discovery.